Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to have you here, and also Professor Michael Klarman. My name is Aline Osorio. I'm the president of the Brazilian Studies Association. This is the first symposium of this kind, but we plan to have this every year. So the Harvard Law Brazilian Association Legal Symposium is an annual congress designed and organized by current students and alumni of Harvard Law School from Brazil. The event will always be held here at Harvard. We believe that the exchange of ideas is the most efficient way to address the latest social changes confronting law scholars and practitioners, as a variety of legal problems are common to both Brazil and the United States. Our goal is to nurture a unique opportunity for networking and learning by bringing together high-profile speakers who will convey their lessons about hot-button issues to an audience of seasoned professors and promising students. We will encourage our guests to explore cutting-edge insights into the design of legal devices as a means of making our societies more equitable in thrilling keynote sessions, panel discussions, and workshops. We are confident that after this event, a message will echo across our nations. Institutions drive progress. I hope you enjoy this week-long symposium, and it will be a pleasure to have you all here. And now Eric is going to introduce our panelists, and we'll start in a few minutes. Thank you.
Bom dia a todos. Vou falar rapidamente em português, porque a língua também conecta culturas distintas, culturas diferentes. Eu acho que ao longo dessa semana que nós estaremos todos aqui, nós perceberemos um paradoxo. Nós perceberemos que o direito é muito menos importante do que nós imaginamos e muito mais importante do que nós imaginamos, porque ele precisa de inputs de outras ciências, mas ele é capaz também de unir todas essas outras ciências. E certamente brasileiros e americanos, professores, magistrados, advogados, enfim, pessoas que trabalham com direito que estarão aqui presentes, perceberão a necessidade de que os acadêmicos voltem a sua atenção para o Brasil. Dificilmente existirá um outro local no mundo com 1 milhão de advogados, com 100 milhões de processos, que esteja passando por transformações tão grandes assim no direito. De modo que é um momento que merece a atenção dos acadêmicos, é um momento que merece muito cuidado com inclusão de gênero, de minorias e de maiorias excluídas em todas essas discussões. É um momento que merece investimento com tecnologia para que haja realmente uma disrupção do nosso sistema de justiça, e um momento que merece diversidade, que merece discussão, e é exatamente tudo isso que nós faremos ao longo desses 5 dias aqui no Brasil. So let me now introduce you Mr. Michael Klarman. Klarman is professor of law at the Harvard Law School. He holds a JD from Stanford Law School and a DPhil in legal history from the University of Oxford. He clerked for the Honorable Judge Ruth Bader Ginsburg and has served as a visiting professor at Stanford Law School and Yale Law School. He has written several acclaimed books, including his last title, The Framers' Scoop, The Making of the United States Constitution. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Michael Klarman.
Welcome to Cambridge, everybody. We ordered up some beautiful weather for you. This is actually pretty typical of Cambridge, where the weather is not ideal. I'm going to talk to you about my book, which was published about 18 months ago. I'm going to try to fit it into about a half hour or 35 minutes at the most, and maybe we'll have an opportunity for a couple questions at the end. So there are 3 points about the book that kind of tie together that I thought I would talk to you about today. The first is that the framers of the Constitution were looking to accomplish two basic things at the Philadelphia Convention. They were trying to shift power from the local and state level to the nationalizing level. So I'll call that the nationalizing features of the U.S. Constitution. They were also trying to constrain popular influence on the national government. I'll call that the anti-populist or democracy constraining part of the Constitution. The second thing I want to talk about is how did the Philadelphia Convention manage to accomplish these things, given that most Americans were not really looking for the Philadelphia Convention to push the country that far in that, so far in that direction. And then third, I'll talk about how they were able to convince the country in a reasonably democratic process that the country should approve a project that was largely addressed toward reducing the influence of ordinary people on government. That seems something of a paradox. Now, I need to qualify the statement that this was a reasonably democratic process. It obviously wasn't very democratic from our perspective. Women were not entitled to participate. Black people were mostly enslaved. They were not participating. Every state had property qualifications on the suffrage, so poor people were not participating. Doesn't sound very democratic from a 21st century perspective, but relative to world history and relative to what was going on in the rest of the world at the time, this was actually the most democratic experiment the world had ever seen. Literally hundreds of thousands of Americans were voting for about 1,500 delegates who would then pronounce a verdict on the Constitution. That was something more democratic than ever had been experienced in world history. All right, so I'm going to start with the first point, the two ways in which the Constitution was perhaps different from what most Americans anticipated or wanted. The first of those is shifting power to the national level. The national government, Congress, was given a virtually unlimited taxing power in the new Constitution. That's to be compared with what existed under the Articles of Confederation, which is the document that governed the country before the Constitution. The Articles had no taxing power conferred on Congress at all. Congress could issue requisitions. Basically, Congress could ask the states for money, but it had no enforcement power, and the states would often refuse to contribute the funds that had been solicited. Second, Congress was given virtually unlimited military powers. Congress could create an army. Congress could create a navy. Congress could call state militias into federal service. Under the Articles of Confederation, again, all Congress could do was requisition troops. It could ask the states to send troops to the Revolutionary Army, but it had no coercive authority. This is a virtually unlimited military power. There are no limits to the number of troops Congress could create, even during peacetime. There was no requirement that Congress raise troops by supermajority vote. It was a virtually unlimited military power. Third, the Constitution gives Congress an unlimited power to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. There was nothing like that under the Articles of Confederation. Fourth, Congress is given implied powers under the Constitution. That's contrary to under the Articles, where Congress was very explicitly denied implied powers. This is in the Constitution's Necessary and Proper Clause, where a bunch of powers are explicitly enumerated, but then at the end of that list, Congress is given the authority to pass additional measures that are necessary and proper to implementing the explicitly granted powers. Fifth and finally, the Constitution supplies a mechanism for enforcing federal supremacy. Under the Articles of Confederation, even when a power was given explicitly to the Confederation Congress, the Congress had no authority to really make its will effective. So, for example, if Congress negotiated a treaty with a foreign power and a recalcitrant state decided to obstruct that treaty, there's nothing Congress could do by way of enforcing the treaty provisions. Madison, who it turns out was the most important individual at the Philadelphia Convention for reasons I'll get into, Madison had his own preferred mechanism of enforcing federal supremacy. He wanted to give the national government an absolute veto over any laws passed by the states. That turned out to be too nationalizing, even for a very nationalist group of delegates, and instead they substituted a three-part mechanism for enforcing federal supremacy. First of all, the Constitution explicitly provides that federal law is supreme over state law to the contrary. Second, they create a mechanism for enforcing that. That's the federal judiciary. There were no federal courts of general jurisdiction under the Articles of Confederation, but the Constitution creates a United States Supreme Court, and it authorizes but does not require Congress to create lower federal court judges. So that's the second provision that establishes federal supremacy. Third, and finally, they create a rule of substantive federal law that they care a great deal about. It's in Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, and it provides both that no state shall make anything other than gold or silver legal tender in the payment of debts, and it provides that states may not impair the obligation of contract. Those provisions were addressed toward a very concrete phenomenon in the mid-1780s that most of the framers were quite aghast at. That was states trying to help out debtor farmers who were being bankrupted in what turned out to be one of the worst economic depressions in American history. And many states were responding to populist demands from farmers by trying to provide them with relief from their debts and from their taxes to prevent them from going bankrupt. Most of the framers, people like Madison, Hamilton, George Washington, thought that those laws represented an official form of theft. You are basically taking the property of creditors and redistributing it to debtors, and the Constitution was supposed to provide a solution to that by vetoing such laws. A majority of states in the mid-1780s had passed such laws, yet the Philadelphia Convention unanimously decided to suppress those laws in Article 1, Section 10. I think that right there tells you there was something a little bit unrepresentative about the Philadelphia Convention. So now I'm going to turn from the nationalizing features of the Constitution to the anti-populist features, and the one I just mentioned is obviously both. Article 1, Section 10 is both trying to constrain state populist measures, but it's also doing so by shifting power to the national government. What are the other ways in which the Constitution is anti-populist? First were long terms in office. Most state legislatures had single-year terms. People were annually elected. Most governors were annually elected. Under the Articles of Confederation, members of Congress served annual one-year terms, meaning they had to be reelected by their state legislatures every year. Under the Constitution, as you may know, representatives serve 2-year terms in the House, presidents serve 4-year terms, and senators serve 6-year terms. There was nothing like that in any state constitution. Indeed, many of the framers wanted to go further. There was a lot of support for the Philadelphia Convention for 9-year terms for senators. 4 state delegations in Philadelphia wanted to make the president eligible to serve for life. No elections at all, just an initial one, and then the president would serve for life. Alexander Hamilton, who was both brilliant and a little bit crazy, he thought senators should serve life terms and presidents should serve life terms. He believed in a Republican form of government. That's the only way you could render property rights sufficiently secure. The framers also favored indirect elections. Only House members were directly elected by the people. Senators were elected by state legislatures. Presidents were selected indirectly by an electoral college, which is still the mechanism for electing United States presidents even today. The framers distrusted the people to play a direct role in electing the president. At the Philadelphia Convention, George Mason, who was an important delegate from the state of Virginia, declared that, quote, "It would be as unnatural to refer the choice of a proper character for chief magistrate to the people as it would be to refer a trial of colors to a blind man." Think about that. Think about running for office sometime on that platform. They had profound distrust for the ability of the people to elect their representatives. Third, They tried to insulate even the House of Representatives, which was the most populous of the branches of the national government. They tried to insulate even the House from direct political accountability. One method of doing that was creating a very small House of Representatives. They thought the smaller the House, the fewer the representatives, the larger the physical constituency they would represent, and the larger the number of constituents that they would be representing. The point of this was twofold. They thought that this would ensure that the better sort would get elected to office, and they thought that the larger the constituency, the greater the number of constituents, the looser the connection would be between representatives and their constituents. The original House of Representatives under the Constitution has 65 members. Compare that, for example, to the lower house of the Massachusetts legislature, which had well over 300 delegates in 1787. The other point is the Constitution omits provision for instruction, for recall, and for mandatory rotation in office, which were features that many state constitutions and the Articles of Confederation had. The purpose of those provisions is democracy enhancing. Instruction means literally that constituents can instruct their representatives on how to vote. So, for example, a Massachusetts town meeting could instruct its representatives in the state legislature on how to vote on an issue like taxation or declaring independence from Great Britain. If a representative defied those instructions, he would be morally bound to resign his position. Constitution leaves that out. Recall means that even during the term in office that you've elected a representative for, they can be recalled by their constituents for any reason. So under the Articles of Confederation, representatives served one-year terms of office, but they could be recalled by their state legislatures at any time. That also, obviously, is a mechanism for enhancing constituent control. The Constitution leaves that out. And mandatory rotation or term limits was a feature of almost every state constitution. For example, you could be governor of Virginia for 3 annual terms, but then you would be rotated out of office. The Constitution omits that as well. The purpose of leaving out these democracy-enhancing provisions was to ensure, first of all, that the national government would never prove vulnerable to the sort of populist demands for relief legislation that most of the states had succumbed to. And second of all, it would enable the national government to block states from passing such legislation going forward. So that's the first part of my talk. The second part is trying to explain how the Philadelphia Convention managed to do these things, which were not exactly what the country had sent them to Philadelphia to do. One leading contemporary critic of the Constitution, and we call these people anti-federalists, that's what they were called at the time, that's how they've been known to historians ever after. One anti-federalist said, and I think this is accurate, quote, "The democratic and aristocratic parts of the community were disproportionately represented in Philadelphia." I think that's accurate, and the question is why, and I'm going to try to give you 5 or 6 discrete explanations, some of which are a little bit speculative, but which I hope together might shed some light on why the Philadelphia Convention did these things. First of all, in almost every state, state legislatures chose the delegates to the Philadelphia Convention. In most states, not all of them, it seems like what the state legislatures were trying to do was to simply send their most eminent citizens to Philadelphia. So, for example, in Virginia, they naturally chose George Washington, they chose Patrick Henry, they chose the governor, Edmund Randolph, they chose George Mason. These were the most eminent citizens of Virginia, and they wanted to be represented in Philadelphia by their best and brightest. However, there were characteristics of being the most eminent citizen which actually correlate with nationalist and anti-populist views. The way to establish a broad reputation turned out to be mostly through service to the national government, a majority of the delegates in Philadelphia had served in the Confederation Congress. That is a nationalizing experience. You're thinking in terms of the national interest, not a parochial interest. Even more importantly, a majority of delegates had served in the Revolutionary Army. That is a profoundly nationalizing experience. You were serving in an army that was fighting to establish a nation, and in addition, the states during the Revolutionary War often proved very obstructionist in terms of pursuing the national agenda, and many soldiers, including George Washington, including John Marshall, the great Chief Justice, they formed distinctly nationalist views in opposition to the recalcitrance that the states had showed in contributing to the common good during the Revolutionary War. The most eminent citizens also, predictably, were fairly affluent, fairly well educated. Those characteristics also correlate with anti-populist views. Those were the people who thought of debt relief legislation as officially sanctioned theft. Second, opponents of this nationalizing and anti-populist agenda had no reason to mobilize against it because they had no way of knowing what would happen at the Philadelphia Convention. It turns out that the agenda of the convention mostly existed in the mind of one man, James Madison. That's not because Madison was the oldest or wisest or most eminent person in Philadelphia. He was only about 36 years old. He was well regarded, but he was certainly not seen to have the kind of clout that someone like Benjamin Franklin or George Washington would have. Madison was influential because Madison was well prepared. More than anybody else, he spent a couple months before the convention looking at the history of confederacies, trying to identify their flaws, and trying to come up with proposed solutions. He then organized the Virginia delegates to show up early in Philadelphia. They collaborated with the Pennsylvania delegates, all of whom conveniently lived in Philadelphia, so they were already there for the convention. And these two delegations from the largest, most powerful states in the Union agreed on a set of resolutions that were profoundly nationalizing and democracy constraining. And then on day one, they presented that agenda to the Philadelphia Convention. Now, Madison didn't get his way on many issues he cared a lot about, but where you end up, of course, is influenced very heavily by where you start, and they started with a profoundly nationalist and anti-populist agenda. Third point, some appointed delegates, some delegates selected by state legislatures, about 8 or 10 of them, they didn't go to the Philadelphia Convention. They turned down their appointments, and then they became leading critics of the Constitution or anti-federalists. That's Patrick Henry in Virginia, Richard Henry Lee in Virginia. These people didn't go to Philadelphia, and the question is why. Now, we don't always have very good explanations, but here's one bit of speculation. Maybe they didn't go to Philadelphia because what they thought the agenda would be was not very interesting to them. They thought the agenda would be conferring a couple of additional powers on Congress, giving it a power to raise revenue by levying tariffs, giving it a power to regulate interstate commerce, but they had no idea that instead it would be a radical reform agenda. If they'd known that was what was going to happen, then maybe they would have shown up in order to resist it. Fourth, and relatedly, there was a decision made by some delegates who were appointed and did go to the Philadelphia Convention to leave early after they saw the nationalizing and anti-populist agenda unfolding. They made a controversial choice, which is they would try to delegitimize the convention by walking out, but by doing so, they made it almost inevitable that the convention would move even further in a nationalist and democracy-constraining way. Fifth, the delegates made the critical decision to close the doors of the Philadelphia Convention. They had some good reasons for doing so. Madison said later if they hadn't done that they would not have accomplished anything. but there were two important consequences of closing the doors of the convention. First of all, closing the doors means there are no newspaper reporters there who can take shorthand and publish speeches in the newspapers. By closing the doors, they liberated the delegates to espouse extreme nationalist and anti-democratic positions that would have ruined political careers had they been made in public. And second of all, by closing the doors, they deprived the anti-federalists of a good 4 months of opportunity to try to mobilize resistance to the Constitution. You can't mobilize resistance if you don't know what's going to happen, and the agenda remained closed and the proceedings confidential until the convention ended about 4 weeks after it began. Sixth and finally, the delegates made a momentous choice, which is that they were going to go for broke. Before the convention, George Washington and James Madison had been exchanging correspondence, and they'd been pleased to discover that they agreed among themselves that they should not pursue what they called temporizing expedients. They thought a radical reform agenda was necessary, and they thought this would be their best and maybe their only chance to achieve it. Randolph, the governor of Virginia, who was introducing the starting agenda that was called the Virginia Plan after the delegates who had drafted it, Randolph, when he presented the plan on the first or second day of substantive deliberations of the convention, said the following. This is according to Madison's notes, which are our best record of the convention. This is Randolph. He, Randolph, would not, as far as depended on him, leave anything that seemed necessary undone. The present moment is favorable and is probably the last that will offer. So they decided to go for broke, and that was an important decision because one important aspect of what they were doing was they were preventing the country from choosing intermediate solutions between the Articles and the radically reformed Constitution. All right, so the third part of the talk is how in the world did they get the country in a reasonably democratic process to approve something, a significant part of which was addressed toward reducing populist control over the national government. Now, the first point I want to make is a point of emphasis. It's not an explanation. We shouldn't assume that it was inevitable the Constitution would be ratified. It's always easy with the aid of historical hindsight to assume that things had to turn out the way they did. For example, the assumption that the North had to win the Civil War, that outcome was actually highly contingent. The best historians will show you that there were 3 or 4 moments in the Civil War which, if things had happened differently, the South would have been able to hold on long enough to wear down the Northerners' will to fight. Same thing's true about the Constitution. It didn't have to be ratified. It was a highly contingent outcome. And the way to illustrate that is simply to point out 2 states initially voted against the Constitution. That's North Carolina and Rhode Island. New Hampshire would have voted against, but the Federalists, the supporters of the Constitution, deftly adjourned the convention, the New Hampshire ratifying convention, when they thought they were going to lose the vote, and they postponed it. It reassembled several months later when conditions had changed enough that New Hampshire ratified. In addition, the votes in 3 of the 5 largest states, Virginia, New York, and Massachusetts, make it clear that ratification easily could have failed. These are 3 of the 5 largest states. In Virginia, the vote was 89 to 79 in favor. In New York, it was 30 to 27 in favor. And in Virginia and Massachusetts, it was 187 to 168 in favor. If 1 or 2 of those 5 largest states had voted against the Constitution, it's not at all clear that the Union could have been successful with those states outside the Union. So why did it happen? Why did the Constitution get ratified? I'm going to mention several advantages that the Federalists, the proponents, had in the ratifying contest. Then I'll briefly mention an anti-Federalist miscalculation, and I'll make a point about how the Federalists very astutely and importantly kept intermediate options off the table, and then I'll be done. Okay, so Federalist advantages. First of all was malapportionment. In South Carolina, the legislature was massively malapportioned, by which I mean simply, as population moved from the Atlantic coast into the western frontier, the legislature never redrew the districts so that everybody across the state had equal voting power. What this meant was Easterners, the people who lived in the Tidewater districts, they had massively inflated political power, and it turns out they were the individuals who were most supportive of the Constitution. These were South Carolina rice planters and indigo growers. They were literally the most wealthy men in the country. They were very large slaveholders. It wasn't unusual for them to be running plantations with 200 or 300 slaves. Those Easterners were about 20% of the state's population, but because of malapportionment, they chose 60% of the delegates to the state ratifying convention. The Constitution was ratified in South Carolina by the convention by a vote of 2-1, whereas most historians think that if you'd had a referendum in South Carolina where everyone's vote counted the same, the Constitution would have been rejected. Second, the press overwhelmingly supported ratification of the Constitution. 90 to 95% of Americans lived outside of cities in 1790. But however, newspapers, for obvious economic reasons, were published almost exclusively within cities. The two main economic drivers of newspapers are subscribers and advertisers, and both of those groups were overwhelmingly supportive of the Constitution. That meant that in many states, it was hard for anti-federalists even to get their essays published in newspapers. Adnis Burke, who was an important anti-federalist in South Carolina, he complained, quote, "The whole weight and influence of the press was on the side of the Constitution." There were about 90 newspapers being published in the United States in 1787-88. Of those 90, only 12 published any significant information critical of the Constitution. Third, several conventions were held in coastal cities where support for the Constitution was overwhelming across class lines. South Carolina Convention was held in Charleston, not in Columbia. Pennsylvania Convention was held in Philadelphia, not York or Lancaster. The Massachusetts Convention was held in Boston, not in Worcester. That was important because, as I've said, support for the Constitution was overwhelming in those cities. This had an effect both inside and outside of the conventions. Every state convention, unlike the Philadelphia Convention, was open to the public. That means that the galleries were filled with people interested in hearing this political debate. In Massachusetts, in Boston, they actually had to change the venue of the location twice because so many people wanted to come and hear. There were 1,000 Bostonians waiting out in the January cold, lining up to hear the debates in the Boston Convention. In Connecticut, for example, the Federalists were so dominant in the galleries that when an anti-Federalist would get up to speak, the crowd would whistle, they would hoot, they would stomp their feet, they would spit at them. There were ways of expressing contempt for the anti-Federalist position. They couldn't even get their speeches heard. In South Carolina, after a day's work at the ratifying convention, they would adjourn to open houses that were put on by the Charleston planter elite, and you can be sure that the crowds that gathered were overwhelmingly supportive of the Constitution. So any delegates who came to the convention with open minds were hearing only one side of the debate, both inside and outside of the conventions. A fourth Federalist advantage was simply the ease of organizing their supporters relative to their opponents. Support for the Constitution, as I've said, was very strong both in cities and along the Atlantic seaboard. Opposition to the Constitution got stronger as you moved into the backcountry and as you moved toward the western frontier. In an era of very rudimentary transportation and communication, that meant that the Federalists had a big advantage. It's obviously easier to communicate within a city, and boat transportation was much superior at the time to land transportation. What this means is, even if Federalists and Anti-Federalists had roughly equal numbers of supporters, which is, I think, what most historians believe, the Federalists were going to have an advantage simply in terms of organizational ease. Fifth point, the better sort, Both sides actually referred to them as the better sort, but when the Anti-Federalists did so, it was with sarcasm in their voice. The better sort, the well-educated, relatively affluent, well-born elite, overwhelmingly supported ratification everywhere but Virginia. In Virginia, the elite was actually split pretty evenly down the middle. This gave Federalists an enormous oratorical advantage at the ratifying conventions. Backwoods farmers could not quote Cicero in the original Latin. They were often intimidated out of speaking before their better educated and more oratorically gifted opponents. For example, at the Massachusetts Convention, Amos Singletary, who was a leading anti-Federalist, complained. Now, you need to understand he is saying this in a voice dripping with sarcasm. He complained of, quote, these lawyers and men of learning and moneyed men that talk so finely and gloss over matters so smoothly to make us poor, illiterate people swallow down the pill. Amos Singletary is not illiterate. Literacy rates among white males in New England was 90%. If nothing else, you had to be able to read in order to read your Bible. Amos Singletary is a well-educated, very fine thinker, and yet he is expressing this enormous disdain for these lawyerly and banking elites which think they know better and are trying to pull a fast one on the rest of the Massachusetts backwoods farmers. Sixth and finally, the last of the advantages of the Federalists is Article 7 of the Constitution. Article 7 was an enormous Federalist advantage which they created for themselves. Article 7 provides that once 9 states have ratified the Constitution, it goes into operation. The other 4 states are free to join or not, but they are unable to prevent the Constitution from going into effect in the 9 states that have ratified. Now think about how that influenced the bargaining power of prospective holdouts relative to the Articles. Under the Articles of Confederation, the last state to ratify an amendment could control whether that amendment went into effect. You needed unanimous consent of 13 states. Under the Constitution, once 9 states ratified, the other 4 states, in theory, can go their own way, but in practice, they will be under enormous pressure to join the newly created union. If they fail to do so, they will be outside of the nation. They will be denied its military power to defend them. They may be treated as foreign countries subject to trade restrictions, and they will be cut out of the important decisions made by the first Congress, which include things like choosing the national capital, which everybody cares a great deal about. So in fact, what happened is once 9 states ratified, the other 4 states pretty quickly fell into line. They didn't really have much choice. 2 last quick points. The Federalists also benefited from anti-Federalist miscalculations, especially in New York and Virginia. New York and Virginia were large, important states. The anti-Federalists in those states agreed that the ratifying conventions would be held late. The Philadelphia Convention ended in September 1787. The first states were holding ratifying conventions by November, 2 months later. New York and Virginia, with anti-Federalist agreement in the state legislatures, did not hold their conventions until June of 1788. That's 9 months later. I think the anti-Federalists probably went along with that because of, remember the point I made earlier, it would take them longer to mobilize their forces. So they might have figured that the longer you could draw this out, the better their chances. But what they failed to consider is, by drawing things out, they made their states irrelevant. By the time New York and Virginia were holding their conventions, 8 states had ratified, and a 9th state was on the verge of doing so. So Virginia became the 10th state to ratify. New York became the 11th state to ratify. Both of those states very well might have come out the other way had they resolved the issue 3 or 4 months earlier, when they would have been playing a significant role in the decision whether to ratify, rather than coming along and facing pretty much a fait accompli. Last point, as I've already alluded to, is the Federalist shrewdness in keeping intermediate options off the table. Most Americans agreed that the Articles of Confederation were flawed, perhaps fundamentally so, but most Americans also thought the Constitution had probably gone too far in the opposite direction. What they wanted was something in between, and the Federalists tried very hard to deny them that option. There were two procedural mechanisms that would have been likely to choose an intermediate solution. One of them is states might have ratified the Constitution, but conditional on amendments being added before it went into effect. We call those antecedent amendments. Ratification contingent on antecedent amendments. The other way they could have gotten an intermediate solution was to have a second convention. Federalists argued that these things were legally not viable or practically a terrible idea. Anti-Federalists actually made pretty good arguments for both procedures. The argument for ratification conditioned on antecedent amendments was that you would have to be a little bit crazy to agree to the Constitution with a vague promise of subsequent amendments, which is what Federalists were offering. Ratify now, trust us, we will give you some amendments that you will like later on. Patrick Henry at the Virginia Convention said, you would have to be a lunatic to do that. It's essentially forming a contract with someone else and letting them specify the terms and change them later on. A second convention seemed like a decent idea for the following reason. You had just had a convention in Philadelphia with an agenda that was kept secret and which produced a result which was profoundly different from what most people were expecting. Now you had a national debate on it. People had expressed their misgivings. Why not elect new delegates to a new convention which could respond to some of those flaws that had been identified? As I said, the Federalists made arguments for why this was not legally viable, why this was a bad idea, but the real reason, I think, why the Federalists wanted to avoid those procedures is because they liked the Constitution they had written in Philadelphia, and they were very uncertain that they could ever duplicate the circumstances that had enabled the Philadelphia Convention to write it. So in this regard, my last point, consider as evidence correspondence exchange between Madison and Randolph before the convention met. Randolph is the governor of Virginia, and he says to Madison a month or two before the convention, whatever we do substantively in Philadelphia, we should submit it to the people in a form where they can choose what they like and reject what they don't like. Madison was horrified by that idea, and he ridiculed the notion that ordinary people could possibly play a constructive role in choosing their own form of government. This is what Madison said to Jefferson later that year in 1787. Quote, in Virginia, where the mass of people have been so accustomed to be guided by their rulers on all new and intricate questions, the matter of whether to ratify the Constitution certainly surpasses the judgment of the greater part of them. Right? Another good platform to run for election on. The people are too ill-informed, ignorant, and misguided to play a role in electing their leaders. All right, so that's what I wanted to say. The framers wrote a vastly more nationalizing and democracy-constraining Constitution. They did it by taking advantage of the element of surprise, and then they managed barely to get the American people to approve it, taking advantage of some luck, some miscalculations by their adversaries, and some very shrewd tactical maneuvering. Happy to take questions. I think we got at least a couple minutes. Is that right? Or
yes. Unfortunately, we're running a little bit late, but
no question.
I'd like first to thank you for the wonderful and insightful thought on behalf of the Harvard Law Brazilian Association.
Thank you.
And also, I think I'll abuse my prerogative of moderator and ask you only one question, if possible. So, because we have a big delegation of judges here today, and could you please talk a little bit of the judicial review and minds of the framers?
Yeah. So we all assume in the United States that, of course, judges have the power to strike down legislation. That actually didn't occupy a lot of their attention in the Philadelphia Convention. The idea of judicial review was a radical idea in 1787. There was no precedent for it in Great Britain, which is where most Americans believe their government institutions came from. Judges in the 18th century in Britain certainly didn't think they could invalidate the will of Parliament. They could stretch to interpret statutes in a reasonable way, but if Parliament explicitly chose to do something unreasonable, no judge in Great Britain in the 18th century thought they had the power to strike it down. No state constitution, and most of the states wrote constitutions during the Revolutionary War. No state constitution explicitly provided for judicial review. Beginning in the early 1780s, there were a small handful of cases where judges either expressed the view that they could strike down laws or actually struck them down. There were not many of those cases. You're talking about in 13 states, at most 5 or 7 decisions over a decade. And the important point to note about those judicial pronouncements of the power of judicial review is that they were profoundly controversial. So when judges in North Carolina or Rhode Island indicated that they thought they had the power to strike down a statute, the legislature actually called those judges to account. They demanded that they show up before the legislature and explain how they thought that they had the power to strike down the will of the sovereign people. At the Philadelphia Convention, the framers would have been aware of these decisions. One of them was being reported in the newspapers even while the convention met. They would have been aware of these decisions, but they also would have been aware of how profoundly controversial they were. They talked about judicial review sporadically. It was not a focus of their intention. They mostly debated things like whether small states would get equal representation in the Senate, how would you choose the president. They were not mostly focusing on whether judges would strike down statutes. The point of creating a federal judiciary was less to strike down laws of Congress than it was to make sure that the federal government had some security from state depredation. So, of course, you needed a federal judiciary to interpret federal taxation law. Of course, you needed a federal judiciary to ensure the enforcement of federal treaties. But the idea that you would actually strike down, especially federal legislation, is not something that was very much in their mind. When they talked about it, a couple of delegates just rejected the idea of judicial review. More of them, but not a very large number, seemed to contemplate that courts would strike down laws. But I think even those delegates had an incredibly narrow understanding of how judicial review would work. They seem to have seen it as operating within 2 limitations. One is you could only strike down laws that were obviously unconstitutional, like, for example, legislature denying a jury trial when the Constitution sanctified the right to jury. And second, issues that were of special concern to judges. So if a legislature tinkered with the constitutional jurisdiction of a court, if a legislature, again, took away a jury trial in a certain categories of cases, those were issues that were especially concerning to the judiciary. But the idea that the court would strike down and be the final verdict on abortion, the death penalty, school prayer, political gerrymandering, national health care legislation, so forth and so on, they never would have dreamed of courts being nearly as powerful as they've become over the course of American history, which isn't necessarily to criticize it. They also wouldn't have dreamed of the United States president becoming as powerful as happened in the 20th and 21st century. They never would have contemplated Congress regulating local hours of work, minimum wages, working conditions. They lived in a different world. They wouldn't have contemplated any of those things. Judicial review is something that maybe they sort of thought of, but not any way near the way we think of it today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. We have a certificate here.